gives really important context, is, before leaning into creative writing and being an author, I've focused primarily on my marketing, right? I went to NYU, as you can see. Went to NYU where I got my MBA in marketing, and I do own a marketing agency. And part of the reason I went into marketing is because I feel there's a certain power in storytelling, not just in the traditional sense, but in the sense of trying to trend people towards doing certain things. And what I've done over time is try to fill the gaps of that storytelling, right? I've used my platform and ability to raise money for certain causes and to help people where I can, and things of that nature. And that's really where the inception for the Black Friend came from, right? I always wanted to end up publishing a few books in my lifetime. I went to undergrad actually for political science and creative writing, but frankly, I didn't see an avenue over the last 10 years, or anything specifically I wanted to talk about or write about. And then I had this idea of writing this trilogy, actually a fictional trilogy that I started working on, and it just so happened that as I was working on that and going to pitch that, one day I was on my way heading to the office, and it's one of those. It's kind of a sunny day like this. I had a coffee in my hand. I'm getting on the subway. I'm feeling good, listening to some Marvin Gaye. I'll never forget that morning and thinking about the book I was writing. And when I got on the subway, if any of you have been to New York or familiar with our transit system, for lack of a better term, is hell, right? Like you're not going to get a seat during rush hour. You're going to stand up. Your coffee's going to shake and fall all over the place. But it didn't matter that day. And I happened to get on the train, and there were 3 seats available. I'm like, oh, today's the best day ever. Today's a perfect day. And so I took the seat that was closest to me, sat down next to this young white woman. And as soon as I sat down, she looked at me as if she was startled, right? Like deeply startled that I had sat next to her. Now, mind you, in terms of respectability politics, I was checking all the boxes. I was wearing a suit, had just a freshly done haircut, things like that. And again, I was minding my business. And I looked at her because I was so confused as to why she was looking at me like that. Not that I hadn't experienced microaggressions, but I literally, it was so, we were on a packed train and I'm absolutely in my own world. And when I looked at her, she clutched her purse as if I was going to steal her purse. And, from there, I just kind of rolled my eyes at her, and she like scoffed and like shook. And she stood up and moved to another part of the subway car, this crowded car. She moved clear across the entire thing. There goes my morning, right? Like there goes my absolute morning, my morning that was going so well, my book that I was thinking about, the work that I had to do at the office. And I went on Twitter after I got off the subway, and I tweeted about the experience, and something really interesting happened. People told me that I was exaggerating and that was not a form of racism, right? They're just like, I don't see the big issue. Maybe she was just having a bad morning, so on and so forth. And I realized something from that interaction, the interactions I was having online. I said, we don't do a good job or even a job at all oftentimes of teaching people that racism is a spectrum, right? We talk about, and not even enough, but we talk about at times, Jim Crow. We talk about slavery. We talk about some of the systems. But what happens in a society where it's not just about systems, it's about individual interactions. It's about individual thoughts. It's, as has been coined recently by many people, racist ideas, right? So that trilogy that I was working on, I put it to the side, and I immediately like went home after getting off of work and just started working on the Black Friend. I was just like, you have to understand what I am talking about, right? And as I started writing it, I said, okay, what gap am I filling, right? Am I filling in a gap that's just for people to understand microaggressions, or can I do something more? And that's when I said, I want to make it as accessible as possible, because I think that these issues start early, right? As is discussed in the book, for those of you who haven't read it, a lot of the timeline or moments that I'm talking about happen in elementary school, they happen in high school, they happen in college, junior high school. And the reason I focused on that is because this entitlement, these behaviors, these interactions, they start at such a young age, right? We learn very young to disrespect other people, but we don't really learn to respect other people. We don't really learn to appreciate other people. And that's why, as I was writing the book, I actually changed my tone, changed my stories, and then geared it towards young people to say, okay, well, if at 12 years old, a racist moment could have happened to me, then at 12 years old, I can also help a 12-year-old understand how to not be a part of and perpetuate said racism. So that was basically the inception of the book, and then the strategy behind the book, the actual read and text of the book. I said to myself also, okay, well, self, you're writing this book, and you're writing it kind of from an echo chamber, right? Like every book, not every book, but most books that we read are the author's thoughts. They are the author's experiences. And because of that, there's a danger when the books are about oppression. And by that, I mean, the people who are doing the oppressing will often say, well, that's your experience, right? If you read a book about feminism, a man can just say, well, my mother doesn't agree with you. Well, your mother also raised you to not be a feminist, and that would make sense. She's conditioned in that system as well. The same way when people talk about race. Well, I have a Black friend who doesn't agree, right? And I thought of that ahead of time. I said, okay, there's two things I'm going to do. One, I have a really sick title now. Thank you for that. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to include the perspective, thoughts, and experiences of other people as well. So the things that I'm talking about throughout the book aren't just my own opinions, right? It's not a matter of them being subjective. These are things that are going to be affirmed by other trusted sources from various walks of life, various races, various experiences. And that's how the book came about. So, what I want to do is I'm going to read a short passage from the beginning of the book in the introduction for those who haven't read it yet. And then I want to first kind of answer questions after reading this passage about some of the things that I brought up in the introduction just now, and also, in terms of the inception of the book. And then I can answer more questions about kind of the broader lens and moment that we are in pertaining to anti-racism, and especially working with young people and other groups around this moment. So I'm gonna get started here. Let's see. Okay. Introduction. One of the most important lessons I learned when I was younger was that being a Black person in this world usually means that at some point you're going to have to do things you don't enjoy. Even more important was learning that many of those things are going to involve white people. For me, that has meant spending a lot of my time as an adult discussing white supremacy, white privilege, and negative aspects of whiteness in general. Anyone who truly knows me would tell you that I'd much rather spend my time tweeting about the Lakers, watching rom-coms, or sleeping. But as I learned a long time ago, there aren't enough people addressing societal issues. So here I am. Because of how publicly critical I am of the impact white people have and have had on people of color and on and on the general world around them, some people have gone so far as to say I hate white people. Honestly, this deeply offends me. As I've been to over 10 John Mayer concerts and at least 2 hockey games, there's no way a person who hates white people willingly attends 2 of the whitest events on earth multiple times. That said, my actual problem with white people is that many just don't have any sense of accountability when it comes to people of color. Accountability not only for the things white people do that often make interacting with them the most frustrating and tumultuous parts of our days, but also accountability for the historic and current inequities and disparities plaguing Black people and people of color as a whole. Which is why I've written this book. Not because of fame, fortune, and a chance to meet Oprah, though that would be pretty dope, but as a Black person, I speak on behalf of people of color, except those on Fox News, when I say we have a white problem. My aim is to help you go from being a person who is learning and unlearning things about these problems created and perpetuated by white people to someone who actively works to solve them. This is called being an anti-racist. I define anti-racist as people who understand that white supremacy isn't something to empathize with Black and brown people over. It's a destructive system in its existence, an existence that white people created, and anti-racists are actively trying to end it. While many believe there's no way to change the problem because they believe there's no way to change white people, I disagree. Because after sitting with and talking to many white people throughout my life, I've come to realize that there are white people who do care and who do believe and want to make change. But these same white people often don't understand the negative impact they're having or how to be better, because many of them have never had the conversations necessary to know this stuff, either in the classroom or outside of it. Let's face it, Black people and people of color are taught in school, in the media, and everyday interactions how to be empathetic and understanding of white people and their history. But most white people never have to do the same for us. For example, I've never met a white person who doesn't know who Christopher Columbus was, even though he didn't discover anything. But most white people can't have an informed conversation about the indigenous people who were already in America and the lingering impact on indigenous people today of so many and so many of their ancestors having been slaughtered by people like Christopher Columbus. Nor do most white people know anything about the white supremacist massacre of Black people in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Though most white people can tell you that Kevin Durant and Russell Westbrook played together for the Oklahoma City Thunder. To put it plainly, we have to learn a lot of white crap, including white history, most of which is not even true. Meanwhile, white people never have to learn about us because doing so would force white people to be held accountable for the many ways they've mistreated and continue to mistreat people of color. This book is an opportunity to change that, to provide some context and history so that is often lacking for white people. Heck, we even added an encyclopedia of racism because my white editor pointed out that many of you reading this might not understand some of the terms I'll be using, some of the events I'll refer to, or certain things and why they're racist. But to the point about people who think white people can't change, I understand and have met those white people too. These are the type of white people who say things like Black people need to get over slavery, or we had a Black president, there's no more racism. These are people who want white supremacy to continue because it benefits them. They are the same people who will say this book sucks, never having read it. But this book isn't for those white people. It's for the ones who want to be better, who want to be better. I said be better twice, it was do better, thank you. But where do white people start? How does someone learn empathy? Is it by watching a specific movie? Listening to an album? I think it starts with understanding. So that's the passage I chose to read from the very beginning of the book. And I think that passage is so important because most people who say, I kind of called out people who I deal with on a regular basis since the book came out, having never read it. They're like, oh, I'm sure that the book is this and that and third. I'm like, well, if you read the book, I call you out right in the beginning of it, quite frankly. But again, I wanted to set the tone early on in the book in a way that's both direct and transparent, but also conversational. And I think that is the tone of the entire book, frankly. My goal is not to shame people. My goal is to be honest. My goal is to be transparent. And that's what people have done with me, right? I'm a cisgender, heterosexual Black man. There's many experiences that I don't have, right? There's many experiences that I'll never have. And communities in which my very existence oftentimes can oppress or even be deadly, those communities have leaned into at times, speaking to me, helping me learn, helping me grow. And I felt like this was an opportunity for me to do the same. So all that to say, I'd love to start out with some conversation now. For those who haven't read the book, that's fine. I think the passage is enough for us to open conversation and dialogue. But I'm really interested to hear from people and get to more of a back and forth similar to what I've created in the book.
Are you okay? I know you had said to kind of put it in the chat, but are you okay to just am I allowed to just say the my part.
I personally, because I'm not running it, I would love that. I think that
Of course.
Okay.
I would love that. Is that okay?
Yes, please go for it. Definitely.
Okay,
Okay.
great. So yeah, let's do that. I think because we have such an intimate setting on this lovely afternoon, let's just ask and speak directly to one another.
So I read your book and it was phenomenal. And I listened to it as well. And the tone of it was just so sincere. And that's one thing that really stuck out with me. But I noticed after I read it, I'm almost more like, I want to learn how to be a better white person. And so I want to be able to engage in these discussions, in these difficult discussions better. And I was hoping, that this book would help me, but I feel like it made it almost, I'm so in my head now. And I guess I'm just looking for like advice on how do I kind of just have those candid and difficult discussions while being a supportive person and empathetic to race, gender, and everything else. Like how do I do that? Because now I kind of like overthink, am I going to say the wrong thing? Am I going to I just want to be helpful. Does that
Yeah,
make sense?
it's interesting because I think a lot of that is in the last story of the book, right? And this concept of being an accomplice, which I always credit Mickey Kendall, the author of Hood Feminism, for. And to me, the idea of being an accomplice is so nuanced, and that's why I wanted this story, and hopefully people pull certain things out of the story. So, in my opinion, it's about taking stock and inventory of your privilege, right? And saying to yourself, okay, with these privileges that I have, with these resources and access and benefits that I have, where can I, instead of taking up space, create space, right? Where can I inject myself that isn't in a way of white saviorism, but in a way that is helping liberate other people and giving them the access they might not currently have. And sometimes it's as simple as saying, okay, there's an organization I really like that's doing really good work that I believe in to dismantle white supremacy, let's say. And I have like a $5 monthly donation, and I'm asking everybody else to donate to that too. Sometimes it can be that simple, or even larger things. Like I'm noticing, when I've gone to protests, a lot of young white people I've seen are like physically placing themselves as barriers between like people of color and the police, right? So instead of them just, and when the media has tried to speak to them, white people are like, hey, don't speak to me, speak to them. I'm only here so that people are less inclined to be murdered, right? I'm here as a buffer, as opposed to someone trying to take up space. So speak to them. I'm a shield, and I think it's that mindset that I'm hoping that people get to, because I don't want it to be a thing where it's like I can't do anything, right? And I can relate to that because I am, like I said, a cisgender heterosexual man, so I have to constantly think of myself in relation to many groups, right? When I'm speaking, even on panels like this, if it's like myself and 3 other women, I got to be strategic, and I want to be strategic. Okay, make sure I'm not talking over people, but then also I'm Black, so are these white women? So how do I like make more equity there? So there's a lot to it, but I think that that's the work. It really is being strategic and doing something.
Thank you so much. That was really helpful. I definitely want to be more of an accomplice and use my voice and anything that I can to really help support. So thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess people can just jump.
Sorry. Okay. Hi. I'm Jessica. I read your book. I loved it. I have a question for you about a particular situation. So I have the proverbial racist uncle, and he doesn't think he's racist because he doesn't hate Black people. And so I'm trying to get through to him with some things. And one thing that he always does is he uses Candace Owens as his shield. And so, well, Candace said this, so it can't be racist. And I don't know how to argue with that because Candace is another Black person. I'm a white person. How do I say that what Candace says is wrong, but what Frederick says is right? And then I get stuck. And then I feel like I don't know where to go with this. So what?
You
What
know,
do I do?
you know what's so funny about that? It's a really good question, and I think it's one that baffles everyone. It doesn't just baffle people around racism; it baffles people around all oppression, right? It's like, oh well, this one woman said that she doesn't care if her son grabs women. She might have even taught him that's what she likes him to do, whatever, right? And I'm writing about it right now in the context of Clarence Thomas, as a matter of fact. So the first thing I'll say is it's a matter of getting your uncle or whomever to understand that white supremacy and racism and all these oppressive forces condition the people who are being oppressed as much as they do to people who are doing the oppressing, right? So Candace Owens is the byproduct of having grown up in a white supremacist society. She's also a major grifter. I don't think she believes half the things she says anyway. But she is a byproduct of something. And the reality of it is you can point out, even in her example, numerous ways that she contradicts herself, right? Like I'm actually really happy to send over articles specifically about her because she has sued over racism before when she was in high school and college and things of that nature. So that's yeah. So it's right on Google. But I'm happy to send it over after. But I think again, the conversations need to be about conditioning at that point, right? So if you do me a favor, can you tell me more about your uncle? Like, give me his background. I want to do work through this actually.
Yeah. So he grew up in South Boston, predominantly white. I will say there's been a change in him since the Trump years. I feel like the Fox News, he's kind of gone down a bit of a rabbit hole. I think he might have had these beliefs before, but he is like one of those, like, I don't see color people. I don't care what color you are. When I try to have these conversations with him, they don't go anywhere, and now, I can say back to him, like, well, they want you to see color, like that's not the goal. The goal isn't to not see color, but he just, I don't know. I didn't realize he was racist growing up, but there were probably things that I believed back then too, that I have had to unlearn since then. And I just find myself kind of being stuck because it's like, it's hard when people just don't want to learn. And I feel like he just doesn't want to hear it. He doesn't want to hear that he's wrong. He has Candace and he has, I don't know what the other guy's name, Terrence Williams.
Oh yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
Those are his two. They're always on his Facebook. He's pulling them out all the time. And I just, and we're getting into fights over Confederate monuments. And I'm like, you live in Boston. Like, why do you care if this statue in Louisiana is coming down? Like,
right.
And
well, in terms of, so let me ask you this: is he a sports fan?
Not really.
What's he a fan of? Like, what's his hobby?
He has a band. He's very into motorcycles, country music. He's very stereotypical. He does the motorcycle ride to Sturgis and.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah. So what I often do with different people is I really lean into empathy as a marketer to get people to kind of reimagine and reassess themselves. So I would find something that he really loves, right? Something that he absolutely relates to in his core. And what I would do from that is rebuke it, right? So let's say he's a big country music fan and he I don't know, Garth Brooks. I don't really know country. Yeah. But let's take Garth Brooks, right? And let's say you said to him, oh, this guy I know, he's a big motorcycle guy to San Third. He loves country music, but says Garth Brooks sucks, right? And he's like, well, Garth Brooks doesn't suck. How could he say that? This X, Y, and Z. Like, well, he also, you essentially, him and you are the same person in many ways. How is his opinion more valid than your opinion about Garth Brooks, right? He's like, well, no or yes, whatever he's going to say, it is going to completely undermine his point about Terrence and Candace being spokespeople for an entire system and an entire group, right?
Okay, yeah.
If that makes sense.
That makes sense.
I've done this with people in my own family as it pertains to homophobia and things like that. Like, oh, well, I know one gay person who just had third. So then I found, again, something that they absolutely feel is not subjective at all, right? They're just like, that's not subjective. This is what we are. This is what we feel, blah, 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 blah. And then turned it on its head to show them how ignorant it is to think that anyone has a monopoly over thoughts as it pertains to something like racism, something like homophobia, something like misogyny, blah, 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 X, Y, and Z. From there, in terms of, the other things that he believes in, I think if you can't get past the point of him, kind of not, what's the word I'm looking for? If you can't get past the point of him not seeing that they don't speak for the entire Black community, then I think you need to have a conversation with yourself after that. If you can't teach him, and say, is it worth it? And I think that's where a lot of people are having difficulty now in this kind of racial reckoning that we're in, of realizing that eventually some people just aren't worth it anymore. And that same energy and those same resources could be applied to other people, right? Like, Trisha, for instance, like, it's like, okay, Trisha asked a really good question, and hopefully my answer and just other things that she's learning now makes Trisha even better than she was yesterday, right? And that's where my resources would go. My resources, like even with this book, I don't think that this book is for your uncle, to be quite frank with you, right? I think this book was probably
to read it, but
he could read it and etc. But I think this book was probably more for you, right? Like the book got you and Trisha to a certain point where you can make community. And I think it's a generational change thing, so that you're not recreating your uncle. I don't know that your uncle is going to necessarily change. I think that the strategies around empathy and using different examples to try to get them just to eke towards it, they work at times. And if they don't work, then you have to have some self-assessment as to like whether you want to just focus on other people who are trying to do the work.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
It totally makes sense. It totally makes sense. Thank you very much.
Yeah. And I truly hope that idea helps. Because again, that's what I've been using for some years now, is leveraging people's interests, their identity, how they show up in the world, and turning it on its head to help them better understand experiences that aren't their own.
Yep. Well, my mom's coming over later, and they used to be close, so I'm gonna pick her brain for ideas on how we can get to them through that way. Anyway.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's just me now. Anybody else? No, that's fine.
I have more. I'm a talker. I'm very vocal. So
that's
I really, I'm glad that you brought that up, Jessica, though, because I kind of have a similar situation with family members, that it's like a weekly argument of trying to get them to see almost eye to eye, but I know they're not even like here. It's and I plan on referencing the Encyclopedia of Racism and getting them all copies and like, educate yourself, please, like make yourself better. But that kind of brings up a good point of like, where else can my energy be focused? But I'm determined to not give up on them. And I feel like they sometimes will make like baby steps, and then they'll say something and I'm like, oh, we're back to square one. So how do you know when to kind of focus your efforts elsewhere? I see these people weekly. I don't want to give up. I just want to keep, I don't want to say pestering, but vocalizing and advocating and educating them until I'm blue in the face.
Yeah, the reality of it is that exists within almost every community. And I don't think that people realize it. And it's just, it manifests in different ways, right? Like I've had to step away from and cut off men who I grew up with, men who I was close with, men in my own family, because there are ways in which they are misogynist, ways in which they are toxic, that after a certain point, I was just like, okay, I've spent years, blue in the face, as you say, trying to get you to change, trying to get you to grow. Why are we still talking about, homophobia in this way, transphobia in this way? And I've presented everything I could present to you. I've done all the different ideas that I just, gave Jessica, and it's not working. So at a certain point, again, I think that there have to be repercussions, right? And some of my own friends and family members didn't change until they saw me step away from them, right? They're just like, you're really not going to be friends with me, or you're really not going to know me over this. I'm like, yes, it's that serious. And I think sometimes what I've seen, at least in having these conversations and having these interactions, is that a lot of white people who are stepping into kind of an anti-racist space want to toe the line, right? But the line is life or death for people who are not white, right? Like, and you can't toe the line. Sometimes it's like either you're going to lean really heavily into it, or you're not. And that's the reality.
I could say, so this is one way that we're using the book. I'm sorry, total 180 actually. That we, people have read the book and then you come and we discuss this type of thing. But what would you like to see as a broader use, like if it were used in schools or colleges or that sort of thing? Like how would you advise folks to interact with your book in a more formalized or structural way?
Yeah, so I think there's a phenomenal teacher's guide, but personally, I think conversations, right? Like the book is a conversational tone purposely. I want this to happen. Like what we're doing right now doesn't necessarily require me, right? It's conversations with people within their own families, within their own friend groups, within their classrooms. And I think a lot of the conversations inherently give voices to people who might not otherwise have them at times. So, one example I'll use is not pertaining to a classroom, it's actually pertaining to a corporate consulting group. I came in to talk about the book with about 90 of their employees, and the people who were non-white didn't have to say much of anything. They just referred to chapters, and the white people that they worked with were just like, oh, I think I've been doing this, right? Or I might have been like, I might be an issue in this way, but they couldn't otherwise say it to them because they are their coworkers, right? It's hard in certain spaces to have the power, privilege, and ability to be honest, frankly, right? Like how does the one Black kid in class say to a room full of 30 white kids, hey, so last week you were touching my hair and I want you to stop. Like it on surface, it sounds like, oh yeah, be empowered, do that. But you're also ostracized then, right? Like oftentimes you are othered inherently. So what this book does is if an educator is having the conversations that are in the book, then there's a certain accountability that just naturally happens without somebody having to be othered, right? It gives that, it actually does empower. So that's how I would like to see it be taught, in a way that's just like, are you all reflecting? What do you all think? Are you upholding any of this? Have you done any of this? Are you confused about any of this? And those conversations will get us to a really healthy point.
Thanks so much. That's really helpful.
I'm back. I have another comment than anything else that I just wanted to tell you that one thing that just struck me in your book was when I was reading some of the stories, like the substitute teacher, whatever, I realized I was reading the story and I was waiting for I'm waiting for the part where like Fred prevails and the substitute teacher gets justice and it doesn't happen. And that in so many of your stories, and I'm nervous, I'm drawing a blank on her name. I think it was Krishna in the cafeteria. Like that story devastated me because I was waiting for like when they got justice and they didn't. And that's what really sunk into me, was that like, there is no justice because this is real life. It's not a movie where the hero triumphs in the end. Like this is what Black people go through all the time. And it just, that to me was like one of the biggest, that's one of the things that really resonated with me in the book.
It's interesting you say that, because a lot of people, have said that to me, right? Like throughout the book, there's these stories and these moments and people are expecting some type of triumphant, save the day, something to happen.
Yes, exactly.
Kind of makes you feel better, because that's how, and I mean, frankly, that's how a typical kind of like white story would go, right? Like, oh, this really bad thing happens to Katniss Everdeen, and and then all these subsequent things happen, and then she triumphs at the end, and she's the queen of the realm or whatever it is. Yeah. But the reality is that oftentimes, we go through our entire lives and it's filled with trauma, and then a lot of us are gone. And I do think that that's important for people to realize that, for people like Breonna Taylor, for people like George Floyd, you know, for all these different people, you know, there is no happy ending, right? Like even on a simple in a simple world, there's no justice either, right? There is, like, you know, Trayvon Martin was murdered, and after Trayvon Martin was murdered, you know, Black people were traumatized, and that's it. That's literally it.
Yeah.
That's the story. Like, you know, George Zimmerman is somewhere floating around, and I wanted people to understand that through my stories, even in a non you know, way of losing life. There, you know, a lot of these traumas I just live with. I just they happened. There was no repercussions for anybody, and they're mine to hold.
Yeah. Yeah. It worked.
Do you have any projects in the pipeline that you're working on now that you'd be excited to see to fruition?
Yeah. I'm actually working on 2 books, one of which is due at the end of this month. The other one is due May 1st. So right before, like literally right before this call, I was writing a point about the question that Jessica asked, in a broader sense, and then I will be back doing that as soon as I get off of this, as a matter of fact. And the first book is called Patriarchy Blues, and it's my debut nonfiction for adults, and that's with HarperCollins. That comes out next February, and that is a book of ruminations, thoughts, screams, if you would, about, you know, toxic masculinity and misogyny, right? Not just in the ways that it's perpetrated, but how did we get here, right? Because I don't feel that since the dawn of time, and it's inherently men and women are supposed to be adversarial, right? There are systems, there is socialization that has happened to make this so, and some benefit from keeping it that way, right? And then also there's just things that, something as simple as therapy. Like, how many men will be different and better for having gone to therapy, right? How much trauma, right? Like, what does it look like to talk to young boys about, you know, something like I have plenty of friends who have been molested, for example, right? And this is something I'm talking about in the book. How does being molested as a young boy or a young man manifest in behaviors of womanizing, toxic masculinity, misogyny, growing up, right? So it's a book about all these different things to try to help all of us better understand and be better generally. And the second book I'm actually co-authoring with my fiance. It's the follow-up to The Black Friend, and it's called Better Than We Found It, and that's obviously as a follow-up. It's a YA book. But what I realized in the last year or so, especially with the presidential campaign, we have a lot of big topics that are going around right now, more than ever, right? Like gun control, ableism, transphobia, homophobia, healthcare, a lot of really big things that people frankly don't necessarily understand because there's so much other stuff to be thinking about. So what we're creating is somewhat of a manifesto, where we'll be bringing in thought leaders and experts, you know, people like Julian Castro, people like Nick Stone, who will all be in the book talking about various things, right? Like housing insecurity. How do we help a young, not just a young person, but an adult as well, understand like the systemic issue of housing insecurity in America, for example.
Well,
That is really that's really exciting to hear. I do kind of have one last, I'll stop talking after this question, and it goes along with the book, but not so much. But how do I have these conversations? Obviously, you've seen my little one bopping around, and I have a bunch of nieces and nephews, and I try to have these difficult conversations with them. But what tips do you have for parents to have this dialogue with your children?
You know, it's interesting because, and this is why I think it's so important that there is a parallel happening, that it's not just parents, but it's also educators at the exact same time. Because I think you can do all the work in the world, but if your kid goes to school and they're learning the complete opposite, right? Like, you know, what is it for? So I think for young people, it's about doing things with them that engage them on thinking about differences, right? Like, and this is why I think the book has resonated so well with, preteens and teenagers, because they're just like, oh, these are experiences as opposed to concepts solely, right? Like, it's one thing to read a history book, but it's another thing to read about like stories, like, oh my God, like to the point that Jessica made, and nothing good happened for him. Why is that, right? And then in the book after, we talk about why that is. So, and I would go through the back of the book and find some of those movies that I suggested, right? And watch some of them with young people, right? With the kids in your life. And that's the reason I gave them, because I do think that storytelling, that empathy building is how people start feeling and seeing things, right? Like, Disney, in my opinion, is like, something like, what's it called? Finding Nemo is an excellent way to start getting young people to talk about ableism and understanding ableism, right? And people who are othered because of their disabilities. And then you can actually have full-length conversations and get them into other books and movies and documentaries, blah, blah, blah. But find the simplest way through storytelling to ignite their mind and then take it from there. So go through the back of the book and see if there's some stuff there.
There were a ton of resources and I appreciated all of them. Thank you.
Yeah. It's so funny. I've more times than not, like I said, it's like a ton of people in these. So I was expecting like everybody's gonna be like, oh yeah, I have a billion questions. I'm like, this never happens. So.
Well, we had one person who took their mute off. So go ahead, make your comment or ask your question.
Hi. So I have a question about like, what are your thoughts? My husband is Latino, and he has a nonprofit here that talks about, or he deals with like making the city better, which a lot of it has to do with like racism and systemic stuff. And one thing we're always arguing about with my parents is kind of like understanding the history, like real history, not just white history. And a lot of times they're like, well, we don't need to know, like that's in the past, like that doesn't matter anymore. And so he's always fighting about that and like generational trauma and systemic stuff. Like, what are your thoughts? Like, is that something that is worth going into, or are there better ways to try to get them to understand and be better at this point?
I think once again, it kind of plays into some of the things that we've talked about, to the point that, or the question that Jessica asked. I'm referencing Jessica a lot because she asked a lot of good questions like Trisha did as well. But, when it comes to family members, it's always important to try, right? It's always important to try, but at a certain point, you have to decide if there's going to be some type of repercussions for them for not showing up in this world in a way that doesn't help further oppression of other people, right? It's that simple. Now, in terms of history, I think that that's one of the most important, if not the most important aspect of the conversations. Because if you can't understand, for instance, like one of the things I'm writing about in my upcoming book is where the white rage, during the insurrection came from, and where the white rage that elected Trump came from. Much of that came from 9/11, right? A lot of it is older than that, but a lot of it was stoked on 9/11 because we built these xenophobic and racist ideals, and this white nationalism was built even further to say, okay, it is us versus the world. They did something to us. We now have a green light to do whatever we want around the entire world. We will destroy what we want, all in the name of the World Trade Center and those that we lost, right? But somehow we respect, those 1,300 or so people more than the 500,000 who just passed of COVID-19. And that's, again, that's deliberate and that's strategic. So things like that is why it's important to understand history to see how we got here. But if people don't want to know that history, there's not really much that you can do. If they don't care about the history, there's not really much that you can do at a certain point. Because, even right now, when someone said to me, oh, why is it that, what did they say? It was on one of these calls like this. They said, well, why is it that Black men are not fathers, right? And I was so offended. I was just so angry. And I said, well, first of all, it's not true. And then second of all, there was a concerted effort, by the Reagan administration, by J. Edgar Hoover and all these different people, especially in the 80s, to imprison Black men, right? You take a whole generation of Black men, and if you watch, Ava DuVernay's 13th, it really details this and chronicles this, but they essentially took an entire generation of Black men and threw them in prison. So what then happens, this is where history is important. What then happens to those people? What's the through line of that, right? So now you have a generation of people who are not in prison, like myself, who, yeah, my father wasn't around. But that's not because Black men are not good fathers. It's because Black men are dealing with systemic oppression created purposely. So all that to say, I know that was long-winded and didn't necessarily answer the question of what you should do, but it speaks to the importance of it. And all I can say is keep trying. And after a certain point, if it's not working, then you need to, again, focus your efforts and your power and resources on your husband's nonprofit and help more people who are actually engaged and actually care.
Thank you. And I do have to say, I have seen, at least with my parents, a big difference probably in the last year, I guess, with all that stuff going on. And obviously our continued discussions about it, because they're also very big on discussing things. We don't always agree and might argue about things, but they think it's important to discuss things. So I've seen them say different things or behave in different ways because of it. So sometimes I do think it's sometimes just the small steps and just, continually pushing to get them to a different place.
Yeah.
Mr. Joseph, at the beginning of the segment, you described your incident on the transit. And, I know that wasn't the first time. You probably had many. And you also mentioned microaggressions. Do you mind just elaborating on, first of all, the definition of microaggressions, and then just the cumulative effect of those microaggressions when they're not addressed?
Yeah, absolutely. So, a microaggression is a form of manifestation of any oppression, because it's not just about race. It's a manifestation of any oppression that is not necessarily overt in nature, right? These are the actions that are built upon problematic, racist, or oppressive ideas that don't necessarily have to do with systems, right? So one example would be a Black woman's hair is, and thinking that you are entitled to touch a Black woman's hair, right? That is not necessarily a life or death situation like we are conditioned to believe racism has to be, but it is yeah, right. It could be. Now you touch the wrong Black woman's hair, it could be, you could lose your hand. But what that is still a extension of racism in the entitlement that you felt to that Black woman's body, to that Black woman's experience, and why you felt it was necessary to take action and explore that, right? Now, in terms of how that systemically can build up over time, it's interesting. Again, I'm writing about this right now. For those of you who haven't read Native Son by Richard Wright, I would suggest reading Native Son by Richard Wright. It's a bit deeper or far deeper than just microaggressions, but it gives an example of the complexities of what happens when you build upon these things on a daily and regular basis. So those microaggressions and transgressions happening to someone on a regular, it alters your perception, it alters your frame of mind, and it impacts, in my personal opinion, your very nature and your soul, right? So I am someone who, as was said by Christina, that interaction on the train was not my first experience. Every single time I get on the elevator with white women, they clutch their purse. Every time I come into my home now, my neighbors always forget who I am, and they look again to make sure I'm who they think I am or not, and all these different things have made me hardened in many ways, right? They've hardened me in many ways, and they've become almost like building a somewhat of a PTSD, if you would, right? A disorder within me where I expect that every time I leave the house, something terrible is going to happen to me, right? Something is going to happen to me every time I get on a Zoom and speak to white people, because I'm just so used to white people living and entitled to microaggressions, right? Because again, they are not, oh, I said the N-word. The N-word is overtly racist, right? It's rather than that, it's, oh, you have an NYU hoodie or an NYU screw neck. Did you play basketball for them? Right? No, I didn't play basketball for NYU. I got my MBA there, but your assumption is rooted in racism. Your assumption is rooted in the preconceived notions and racist ideas that you've been taught over time. And I have to deal with that every day. Like a Black person in this country deals with that every single day. The assumptions, the tropes, the stereotypes, and all that does is erode at the very being of a person.
Thank you. I know you mentioned, you described that early in the book, going to the your quote friend's dinner. And as soon as you were greeted by the father, microaggression. You had dinner, microaggression. The chicken comment, microaggression. The basketball comment, microaggression, and all that was, as a guest in their home.
Yeah. I mean, it's such an important conversation, and that's what, again, like I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons I wrote the book is because, we don't talk about it, right? Like on a systemic level, we don't talk about it, we don't teach about it, and it's such an issue because in ways, like I think I've been called the N-word twice in my life, twice maybe, and obviously that was devastating. But in my 30s, what has completely altered my being is the perception in problematic ways that I've been having to deal with about who I am, what I am, why I am, and how I am since I was out of my mother's house in elementary school, right? Like that's how long it's been happening and how ingrained it is in our culture. As you read, if you read the book, my substitute teacher was doing it to me, right? And that manifested and evolved from a moment of just not only a microaggression, but into blatant racism, right? But it was rooted in the microaggressions and problematic envisioning of a Black person that she had based on what is probably generational microaggressions and generational things that she's been taught. All the while saying, well, I'm not racist because I don't say the N-word. I'm not racist. I have a Black friend. I'm not racist. I turn my head when people are lynched. That's disgusting, right? Not realizing the entire time you think that every Black man that is on the same street as you is going to rob you, right?
Thank you.
Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left. Are there any other last questions, or maybe things that really stuck with people? Or
I just want to say thank you for writing this book. Just plain and simple, thank you.
I appreciate that. It really does. It means a lot. I don't know if any of you follow me on social media, but I kind of call out sometimes when I receive like death threats and things of that nature. And it's pretty wild. I think anyone who like follows me actively knows I talk about a lot of really important things, and they're usually intersectional. I talk about the rights of people who I am not a part of their community as much as I talk about the rights of my own community, and even the ways in which my presence can oppress other people through class, through gender and things of that nature. So I just, the hate sometimes is just unbearable, and hearing kind things does mean a lot.
Would you mind typing your Twitter into the chat so
Sure.
maybe folks can follow you?
Sure.
All
So
right.
this is my Twitter and Instagram for anyone who doesn't have it.
One more.
Oh, I just had a question. This is great, Fred, really wonderful. And I've ordered the book. I hadn't read it before, but I'm just put in the order. So, but I had just a question about, so another book I'd read recently was called My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem.
Mm-hmm.
And which is a book I highly recommend to everyone on this call. Wonderful writing and messages from him. But and I don't know if you're very familiar with him, but one of his kind of beliefs has to do with the intergenerational aspect of racialized trauma, and how to heal that you need to sort of have more of a what he calls sort of somatic or body oriented exercises and practices to try to heal it. And I guess, I guess my question is just, do you have some perspective on that or any thoughts about that? And because it does seem to me that there is, for a lot of people, where this is passed down for the oppressors, it gets passed down racist behavior and beliefs, and then it's those are the people that need to be reached the most in some ways. And but how do you actually do that? And maybe this is one part of the solution. I guess it's just a question. So
yeah, I think that's such an important question. It's an important concept, and I'll be honest with you, I'm really bad at it, right? I'm someone who I was never taught how to necessarily heal, right? And I do think that, and this goes back to something that Trisha asked earlier. As we're doing this work and where people are figuring out where they can be involved and how they can be supportive, I also think that leaning into ways to help pour back into the cups of people who have been oppressed, right, is deeply important, deeply transformative, and it's not work that I have expertise in. To be quite frank, it is work that I need to learn how to do, because I am so conditioned in trying to combat systemic and systematic oppression that I don't even take the time to navigate my own body that lives through it. And that's why I said, to the point that Trisha, was thankful for the book, that for me is transformative. I don't get a lot of that. I barely get any of it, right? Like, I don't really get positivity. So I think we all need to be thinking about that. It's an excellent point. And for people on here who are white and want to do more and, all these things, find organizations, find people, however your connections are, and see in what ways you can help fortify this moment, fortify this movement, build it back up, build the people back up, because there is a lot of, again, pouring from the cups, doing the teaching, being traumatized or re-traumatized, but there's not a ton of healing necessarily happening at the same time.
Yeah, no, thanks. Great points. And yeah, I mean, I think like you're saying, it's just each of our own ways, try to make some small steps forward and get involved. And like I'm in my company, I'm serving on a diversity and inclusion advisory board with my company, and that's been a really great way to at least start internally at this firm and work towards better future. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I'd just like to thank you again, Frederick Joseph, for coming and sharing your wonderful words with us and sharing your fantastic book with us. I would also like to thank World of Wellesley, who bought us a few copies of this book at Wellesley Free Library. So if you'd like to recommend it to people, they can definitely put it on hold. And yes, I'll echo that it was such a fantastic book, and we look forward to your next one. So good luck writing.
Thank you. And I appreciate being here. I appreciate, everyone taking your time. Again, go enjoy the weather if you have the time today. I see some of you have children with you. Get your children outside. It's sunny out. And the last thing I'll say before I go is, no one has all of the answers, right? Like, I know for some of you who ask questions, hoping for something that might be transformative, no one has all these answers. And that's why I think this book and my work is telling people to take seats at the table, right? We all need to be in this trying to figure it out together. So we can't lean on one person or one group to figure it out by themselves. The issue is created by many, and it shouldn't be solved by the few.
Well, thank you once again, and
Thank
we're
you.
really glad to have you.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. No. Right. See you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.